The wine glass shattered against the marble floor before Daniel Cole even understood what had gone wrong. And for one suspended second, the entire dining room of Aurelia turned to look at him instead of at the woman who had knocked it over. Vivian Cross did not apologize. She never did. She simply raised her chin, let her eyes sweep across the shards scattered near her Louboutins, and said loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "I asked for the Bordeaux decanted 20 minutes ago." Is competence too much to expect from the staff here? Or is this establishment simply hiring anyone off the street now? The maitre d' rushed forward with a tray of apologies already forming on his lips, but Daniel was already on his knees gathering the glass with steady hands that did not shake, though something behind his ribs had gone tight and cold. He had poured that Bordeaux himself 12 minutes earlier, decanted exactly as requested, and set it at her elbow before she'd waved him away to take a phone call. She had knocked it over, reaching for her napkin. He knew this. Everyone at the table probably knew this. None of it mattered, because in a room like Aurelia, blame traveled downward, and Daniel Cole, 34 years old, a single father working a 14-hour shift on 4 hours of sleep, had learned a long time ago that dignity was a currency he could rarely afford to spend. "I decanted it at 7:40, Miss Cross," he said quietly, still crouched, not looking up right away. "You were on a call when I set it down." He said it the way a man diffuses something rather than the way a man fights. But there was a current underneath the words, something that made the businessman across from Vivian glance up sharply, sensing a shift in temperature he couldn't quite name. Vivian's eyes narrowed. She was not used to being corrected, least of all by someone in a black vest and a name tag. And the correction landed somewhere it shouldn't have, somewhere close to a memory she didn't like touching. "Excuse me," she said, and the two words came out clipped, dangerous, the tone she used in boardrooms right before she ended someone's career. Daniel finally stood, tray of broken glass balanced in one hand, and met her eyes directly, which very few employees at Aurelia dared to do. "I'm only saying it so the next person doesn't get blamed for it," he said. "It happens. Glasses tip. It's not a crime. It should have ended there. It didn't." "Are you correcting me in front of my associates?" Vivian's voice climbed half a register, and the businessman beside her, a soft-bodied man named Grant Pearsall, who represented the firm she was trying to court for the Halden merger, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that this had stopped being about wine. Vivian had not slept well in 3 nights. The Halden deal was hemorrhaging. Her legal team had delivered bad news that morning about a licensing gap no one could explain, and her Uncle Whitman had spent the entire car ride over, reminding her that the board was watching her handle this the way they watched a surgeon's hands during a first solo operation. She was primed for a fight before she ever sat down, and Daniel, without meaning to, had handed her one. "I'm not correcting you," Daniel said, and something in his calm was more infuriating to her than anger would have been. "I'm just not going to apologize for something I didn't do. That's all." A beat passed. Vivian's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "How admirable," she said. "A waiter with principles. I'm sure that pays the bills wonderfully." The words were meant to cut, and they did, but not in the direction she expected. Daniel felt the insult land somewhere old, somewhere that had nothing to do with Aurelia or wine glasses, and for the briefest moment, something flickered behind his eyes that had nothing to do with servility. He thought of Emma, at home with a fever the school nurse had called about that morning, of the specialist bill from Dr. Anwar's office still unpaid on the kitchen counter, of every choice that had led him to this floor, with a tray of broken glass in his hand, instead of a lab and a team and a name that used to mean something in rooms exactly like this one. He set the tray down on a service stand with deliberate care, the kind of care that made Grant Pearsall lean back slightly without knowing why. "Miss Cross," Daniel said, and his voice had dropped, gone quiet in a way that somehow carried further than her raised one had. "You don't know anything about what pays my bills, or what I've given up to pay them. So I'd be careful mocking people you know nothing about." Vivian's eyebrows lifted, genuinely startled now, because employees did not speak to her this way, not ever, not in 12 years of building an empire out of other people's fear. "Is that a threat?" she asked, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. "No," Daniel said, already turning to leave. "It's just true. Mock me again, and see what you actually get for it." He walked away before she could answer, weaving through the dining room with the tray balanced against his hip. And behind him, he heard Grant Pearsall clear his throat and mutter something about the check. Heard Vivian's silence stretch a half-second too long to be indifference. Other diners had gone quiet in the particular way people do when they've witnessed something they intend to gossip about later, and the young sommelier near the wine cabinet caught Daniel's eye with an expression somewhere between admiration and alarm, as if he'd just watched a man walk calmly into traffic and come out the other side unscathed. Daniel didn't slow down to acknowledge any of it. He had 11 minutes left on his break, and a text from Mrs. Alvarez, his elderly neighbor who watched Emma some afternoons, saying the fever had climbed to 102, and Emma kept asking for him. He ducked into the back hallway near the kitchen, pulled off his apron with hands that were finally allowed to shake now that no one important was watching, and dialed the pediatric clinic with his shoulder pinned against the wall. The receptionist told him Dr. Anwar could see Emma at 5 if he could get there, and Daniel did the math. He always did the math of shift hours against bus schedules against the $60 left in his checking account, and told her yes, he'd be there. Before he'd even confirmed it with his manager, he found his manager Renee restocking napkins near the host stand and told her he needed to leave 20 minutes early, that his daughter was running a fever and he had a doctor's appointment he couldn't miss. Renee, who had 2 kids of her own, and a soft spot for Daniel that she rarely admitted to management, glanced toward the dining room where Vivian Cross's table was still simmering with unresolved tension, and sighed. "That woman already asked to speak to a manager about you," she said. "I haven't gone over yet. You want to tell me what happened before I do?" Daniel gave her the short version, flat and factual. The wine, the timing, the comment about principles and bills. Renee's jaw tightened, not at Daniel, but at the familiar shape of the story. The kind that played out in expensive restaurants every week and always ended the same way, with the person who had less power absorbing the cost of someone else's bad day. "She's the type who tips well and complains worse," Renee muttered, mostly to herself. "I've dealt with her before. Go," she said finally. "I'll handle Cross. Go be with your kid." Daniel thanked her in a voice that came out rougher than he intended, grabbed his jacket from the staff room, and pushed out through the service exit into the gray hush of early evening, the cold slapping some of the tension out of his shoulders before he'd even reached the sidewalk. The walk to the bus stop took 6 minutes, and Daniel spent every one of them replaying the exchange, not because he regretted it, but because some old buried part of him had recognized something in the way she'd said, "mocking people you know nothing about." It wasn't just anger talking, it was true. He thought about the life he used to have, back when his name was still attached to research papers instead of a name tag, back when Sarah was alive and they'd stayed up late at the kitchen table arguing over sensor calibrations and laughing about nothing, back before the diagnosis that ate through their savings in 11 months and left him standing at her hospital bed doing math he still couldn't forgive himself for. He had walked away from an entire career not because he lost his mind for it, but because grief made the work unbearable, and because every dollar he could earn immediately mattered more than every dollar a slow-moving patent might someday pay him. He had signed the assignment papers under a name that wasn't quite his, Coleman instead of Cole, some small private rebellion nobody would ever notice, and disappeared into the ordinary world of shift work and single fatherhood, telling himself it didn't matter anymore. Standing at the bus stop with the cold air biting through his jacket, he wasn't sure that was true tonight. The bus arrived 4 minutes late, and Daniel spent the ride with his forehead against the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of amber light, thinking about Emma's small, hot hand in his that morning before school, about the way she'd said, "I don't feel good, Daddy," in a voice too tired for a 6-year-old. He thought about Vivian Cross exactly once more during that ride, not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity, wondering distantly what it must feel like to move through the world so certain that consequences belonged to other people. He didn't know yet that her company was 3 weeks from a merger collapse over a licensing gap that traced, if anyone bothered to dig deep enough, straight back to a patent filed 9 years ago under the name D. Coleman. He didn't know that the woman who'd humiliated him over a wine glass would soon need something only he could give her. He only knew that Emma was waiting, fever climbing, asking for him, and that whatever pride he had left tonight belonged to her, not to the woman in the black dress who thought a name tag made a man invisible. He got off 2 stops early to save 4 minutes on foot, jogging the last block toward Mrs. Alvarez's building, with his work shoes slapping against the pavement, his mind already narrowing down to the only thing that mattered. A small, fevered girl who didn't care what her father used to be, only that he showed up. Mrs. Alvarez met him at the door with Emma bundled in a blanket on the couch, cheeks flushed, pink eyes glassy, but brightening the second she saw him. "Daddy," she said, reaching up with both arms, and Daniel scooped her against his chest without bothering to take off his jacket, pressing his lips to her too warm forehead, murmuring that he was there, now that they'd get her fixed up. Mrs. Alvarez waved off his thanks and told him to go, that she'd already called ahead to let the clinic know they were running close, and Daniel carried Emma out into the evening with her arms looped loosely around his neck, her breath warm and uneven against his collar. Dr. Anwar's office was quiet by the time they arrived, and the exam took 20 careful minutes. Ear infection, nothing dangerous. A prescription and instructions to keep her hydrated and watch for changes overnight. Daniel sat in the plastic chair beside the exam table, listening with the particular focus of a man who had once understood far more complicated diagnoses than this one, nodding at the right moments, asking the right questions. And when Dr. Anwar handed him the prescription slip, he did the math again, without meaning to, copay against the $60 against the light bill due Friday, against the birthday in 6 weeks that Emma had already started asking about. He didn't let any of it show on his face. He never did, not in front of her. By the time they walked home together, Emma half asleep against his shoulder, the medication tucked into his jacket pocket, the confrontation at Aurelia had settled into something distant, a small bruise rather than an open wound. One more thing that had happened to him, rather than something he needed to carry. Behind him in a dining room he would probably never set foot in again. Vivian Cross sat rigid in her chair long after Grant Pearsall had made his excuses and left, staring at the space where Daniel had been standing, replaying his last 4 words with an irritation she couldn't quite explain to herself. "Mock me again and see what you actually get for it." It sounded, she thought uneasily, less like the empty defiance of an overworked waiter, and more like a promise from someone who knew exactly what he was worth, even if the world around him had temporarily forgotten. She told herself it didn't matter that she'd forget his face by morning, that men who talked like that usually had nothing behind the words but wounded pride. But some small, unfamiliar part of her, the part that had gone quiet the night her own father taught her that weakness was the only unforgivable sin, kept turning the sentence over, long after her car pulled away from the curb. long after the city lights blurred past her window on the way home to an apartment that had never once in 5 years felt like anything more than a very expensive place to be alone. The conference room on the 41st floor of Cross Dynamics smelled like burnt coffee and barely contained panic, and Vivian sat at the head of the table with her hands folded in front of her, listening to her chief legal counsel explain for the third time in 2 days why the Halden merger was hanging by a single thread that no one seemed able to identify. "The issue isn't the valuation," said Marcus Webb, sliding a folder across the polished surface with more force than necessary. "The issue is the sensor calibration technology embedded in the Halden manufacturing line. It's licensed, has been for 9 years, and whoever holds that license has to sign off before we can fold their operations into ours." Vivian opened the folder and stared at a name she'd never heard before, printed in flat, unremarkable type at the bottom of a patent filing. D. Coleman. "Who is that?" she asked, though it came out less like a question and more like an accusation aimed at the universe for producing one more obstacle in a week already full of them. Marcus shook his head, and the motion carried the particular helplessness of a man who had already exhausted every avenue available to him. "We don't know. The patent was filed independently assigned through a shell entity, and the trail goes cold after that. No forwarding address, no active business registration, nothing. We've had 2 investigators on it for a week." Vivian's uncle, Whitman Cross, sat at the far end of the table with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the posture he adopted whenever he wanted to appear thoughtful rather than nervous. And Vivian had learned over the years to distrust that posture more than almost anything else about him. "This deal collapses without that signature," Whitman said, his voice smooth in the way that made boardrooms trust him and made Vivian increasingly uneasy. "The board will not tolerate another failed acquisition this year, Vivian. Not after Danvers." He didn't need to elaborate. Danvers had cost the company $11 million and Vivian's 6 months of sleepless nights, and everyone in the room remembered exactly whose signature had authorized it. "Then find him," Vivian said, closing the folder with more composure than she felt. "I don't care what it costs. If this D. Coleman is alive and reachable, I want him in a room within the week." The meeting dissolved into the usual scramble of assignments and deadlines, and Vivian excused herself before anyone could ask her the questions she didn't have answers for yet. Walking the long hallway back to her office, with her heels striking a rhythm against the marble that matched the tightness building behind her sternum. She had built Cross Dynamics into something that mattered, had spent 12 years proving to a board of men twice her age that her father's death hadn't handed the company to someone unqualified to hold it, and now a single missing signature threatened to unravel all of it over a piece of technology nobody could trace. She sat at her desk, pulled the folder back open, and stared again at the flat, anonymous letters of a name that meant nothing to her yet. That evening, exhausted and unwilling to face the silence of her apartment, Vivian found herself back at Aurelia without entirely deciding to go there, the way people sometimes return to the scene of something unresolved without admitting to themselves why. She told herself it was simply the closest, decent restaurant to the office, that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, that it had nothing to do with the waiter who had spoken to her 4 days earlier, with a steadiness that still bothered her more than she wanted to acknowledge. Renee greeted her at the host stand with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, seated her at a corner table, and Vivian ordered a glass of wine she didn't really want, mostly to have something to hold while she waited for a version of calm that hadn't been available to her in days. She didn't notice Daniel at first, not until he passed near her table, carrying a tray toward another section, and something in her chest tightened in a way she immediately resented. He noticed her too, of course, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. the memory of their last exchange sitting visibly between them like a held breath. It was Vivian, surprisingly, who spoke first, though the words came out stiffer than she intended. "You were right," she said. "About the wine. I checked the receipt timestamps." Daniel paused, tray balanced against his hip, studying her for a moment, as though trying to determine whether this was an apology or simply a fact delivered without context. "I know," he said finally, not unkindly, but without the deference she was used to receiving from people who worked for institutions she frequented. "I don't usually get things wrong about my own job." Something in his tone, dry and faintly amused despite everything, caught her off guard enough that the corner of her mouth twitched before she could stop it. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you do." An uncomfortable silence stretched, neither of them quite sure how to end an exchange that had started as an apology and drifted somewhere else entirely, until Vivian, almost against her better judgment, gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Do you have a break coming up?" she asked. "I'd like to ask you something. Not about the wine." Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen, where Renee was watching the exchange with poorly concealed curiosity. And something in him, some old reflex he thought he'd buried years ago, made him set the tray down at the service stand and take the seat across from her, though he kept his posture careful, guarded, the posture of a man unwilling to be caught off guard twice by the same person. "I've got 10 minutes, he said. "What is it?" Vivian slid the folder she'd been carrying, foolishly unnecessarily, across the tablecloth, opened to the page with the patent filing, and watched his face as he looked down at it. For half a second, something crossed his expression, quick and sharp, and immediately smoothed over something that Vivian, trained by years of reading boardroom faces for weakness, recognized instantly as recognition. "Do you know anything about sensor calibration technology?" she asked, watching him carefully now. "Specifically, manufacturing line calibration, something patented about 9 years ago under the name D. Coleman." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he closed the folder before answering, sliding it back toward her with 2 fingers as though it had suddenly become something he didn't want to touch. "Why are you asking me?" he said, and his voice had gone careful in a way that made Vivian lean forward slightly, sensing, without understanding why, that she'd stumbled onto something real. "Because 3 days ago, you corrected a wine timestamp with the precision of an engineer, and tonight, you're looking at a patent filing like it means something to you," Vivian said. "I'm not stupid, Mr. Cole. I read people for a living. Something about this bothers you." Daniel held her gaze for a long moment, weighing something internally that Vivian couldn't see. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier dryness, gone flatter, more guarded. "I used to work adjacent to that field," he said carefully. "A long time ago. I don't know the specific patent you're referencing." It was, Vivian would later realize, the first outright lie he'd told her, though she couldn't prove it yet, could only sense the careful construction of the sentence, the way he'd chosen each word like a man laying stepping stones across water he didn't trust. "Adjacent to it," she repeated slowly. "What field, exactly?" Daniel stood before answering, gathering the tray back into his hands, putting physical distance between himself and the conversation, the way he'd once put emotional distance between himself and an entire career. "Biomedical engineering," he said. "Before. It doesn't matter anymore." He walked away before she could press further, and Vivian sat alone at the table, staring at the folder, feeling the shape of something important slide just out of reach. She didn't sleep well that night, turning the conversation over in her mind the way she'd turned over his earlier words about mocking people she knew nothing about. And by the time morning arrived, she'd made a decision that surprised even her. calling Marcus Webb before she'd finished her coffee and telling him to run a deeper background search, not on D. Coleman specifically, but on any biomedical or sensor engineers named Cole or Coleman who had left the industry within the last decade. Marcus, unaware of the personal thread pulling at her attention, simply noted it down as another lead and promised results within 2 days. Vivian told herself this was purely professional curiosity, that any competent executive would chase down a thread this promising, and refused to examine too closely why her pulse had quickened at the memory of Daniel's guarded expression, why some part of her had wanted quite badly to know more about the man behind the name tag. 2 days later, Marcus returned to her office with a printout and an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between triumph and confusion. "There's a Daniel Cole," he said, sliding the paper across the desk. "Biomedical engineering PhD. Worked at a startup called Halcyon Diagnostics 8-9 years ago, developing calibration systems for portable diagnostic devices. Left the industry abruptly after his wife's death. No professional activity since. Current employment listed as food service." Vivian felt something cold settle in her stomach as she stared at the name at the photograph attached to an old conference badge, younger, less guarded, but unmistakably the same man who had corrected her about a wine glass and then lied to her face about a patent 3 nights later. "Is there a connection to D. Coleman?" she asked, already knowing somehow what the answer would be before Marcus spoke it. "Circumstantial," Marcus admitted. "The timeline lines up. Cole to Coleman isn't a large leap, and shell entities like this one are often registered under slight name variations for privacy. I can't confirm it without more digging, but if I had to guess..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Vivian was already staring past him out the window at the city skyline, replaying every guarded word Daniel had spoken to her across that table, understanding now exactly what she'd been looking at without recognizing it. Her first instinct, sharp and immediate, was anger. The particular anger of someone who feels they've been made a fool of, though even as the feeling rose in her chest, she recognized it wasn't entirely fair. He hadn't lied outright. He'd deflected, protected something the way people protect things that have already cost them enough. But beneath the anger sat something more complicated, something closer to shame, because she remembered exactly how she'd spoken to him that first night. The words about principles and bills. The casual cruelty she delivered without a second thought to a man who had now appeared had once stood in rooms not unlike her own boardroom, brilliant and respected, before life had taken something from him large enough to make him disappear into anonymity rather than face it. She thought of her own father, of the ruthless certainty he'd taught her was the only acceptable way to move through the world, and wondered, not for the first time, how much of her own cruelty had been inherited rather than chosen. "I need to speak with him directly," she told Marcus. "Discreetly. Not through legal, not yet. I want to understand what we're dealing with before this becomes a formal negotiation." Marcus nodded, made a note, and left her alone with the printout and the photograph and the slow, uncomfortable recalibration happening somewhere behind her ribs. She thought about calling Aurelia about showing up unannounced and dismissed both ideas as too clumsy for what this situation required. Instead, she waited 2 more days, watching Marcus's investigators quietly confirm what she already suspected. The Halcyon Diagnostics patents, the calibration systems, still cited in current manufacturing standards across the industry. The abrupt resignation letter Daniel had filed the month after his wife's funeral, citing personal reasons, in language so restrained it made something in Vivian's chest ache in a way she wasn't prepared for. Meanwhile, 3 floors below the executive suite, in an office Vivian rarely visited, Whitman Cross sat alone with his own printout, delivered to him by a source inside legal who owed him more favors than either of them cared to count. He stared at the name D. Coleman for a long time, his expression unreadable, and when he finally set the paper down, his hands were not entirely steady. He remembered a younger version of Daniel Cole from a decade ago, a name buried in old project files from a licensing negotiation Whitman had personally overseen back when he still ran Cross Dynamics' Technology Acquisitions Division. A negotiation where credit had been distributed in ways that conveniently favored the company and inconveniently erased the name of the engineer who had actually built the technology in question. Whitman had assumed reasonably that the man had simply vanished into obscurity, grateful for the settlement, unlikely ever to resurface in a position to cause trouble. He picked up his phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in years, and spoke in a low voice that carried none of his usual boardroom warmth. "We have a problem," he said, "and I need to know exactly how much he remembers." Back at her desk, unaware of the conversation happening below her, Vivian made her decision. She would go to Daniel directly, not as a CEO cornering a witness, but as someone who owed him, at minimum, an honest conversation. She told herself this was strategy, the smartest path toward salvaging the Halden deal, and refused to examine too closely the small, persistent hope underneath the strategy. The hope that when she finally understood the whole truth about Daniel Cole, some part of what she found might not be about business at all. Daniel was folding napkins in the back of Aurelia's service station when Renee found him with an expression he'd learned to be wary of the particular tightness around her mouth she wore whenever something inconvenient had walked through the front door. "Vivian Cross is here," she said. "Not for dinner. She asked for you specifically. Said it's not about the restaurant." Daniel set down the stack of linen and felt something settle low in his stomach, a familiar dread mixed with something else he didn't want to name yet. He'd known, somewhere beneath the surface of his careful denials 3 nights earlier, that the folder she'd shown him wasn't going to disappear quietly, that a woman like Vivian Cross didn't chase down half answers without eventually finding whole ones. He wiped his hands on his apron, more out of habit than necessity, and walked out to the small private dining room where Renee had discreetly seated her, away from the main floor and its usual audience. Vivian stood when he entered, which surprised him. Some old reflex of formality that didn't match the woman who'd humiliated him over a wine glass less than 2 weeks earlier. She looked different tonight, less armored somehow, dressed simply in a dark coat she hadn't bothered to remove, as though she wasn't entirely sure she'd be staying long enough to need to. "I know who you are," she said without preamble, sliding a folder across the small table between them, thicker now than the one she'd shown him before. "Daniel Cole, Halcyon Diagnostics, the calibration patent filed under Coleman 9 years ago. I know about Sarah." His name in her mouth carried a strange weight, both his names actually, and Daniel felt the careful architecture he'd built around himself for 8 years crack slightly at the mention of his wife, a name he hadn't heard a stranger say aloud in longer than he could remember. He didn't sit down. "Then you know why I didn't want to talk about it," he said, voice low, controlled in the way he'd trained himself to be controlled around anything that threatened to reopen what he'd spent years trying to close. "I don't actually," Vivian said, and for once there was no edge in her voice, no boardroom sharpness, only something closer to genuine confusion. "You built technology that's still cited across your entire field. You could have leveraged that patent for millions. Instead, you disappeared and started waiting tables. I don't understand what happened to you, and I'd like to, because right now, my company needs your signature to save a merger worth $400 million, and I refuse to walk into that negotiation without understanding the man on the other side of the table." Daniel finally sat slowly, the fight draining out of him, just enough to make room for exhaustion instead. "Sarah got sick 11 months before she died." He said, the words coming out flatter than he intended, worn smooth from years of not saying them aloud. "Ovarian cancer caught late because we couldn't afford the kind of screening that catches it early. I was 3 years into building diagnostic calibration systems that could have caught exactly what she had. And none of it mattered, because insurance doesn't move at the speed research does. I spent every dollar we had trying to buy her time. When she died, I didn't want anything to do with the industry anymore. I sold the patent rights under a name that wasn't quite mine, because I couldn't stand seeing my own name attached to something that hadn't saved the one person I needed it to save. Vivian sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing this. And something in her expression shifted, softened in a way Daniel hadn't expected and didn't entirely trust yet. "I'm sorry," she said finally. And it sounded, for the first time since he'd met her, entirely unrehearsed. "I said cruel things to you over a glass of wine, and you'd already survived something I can't imagine." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in her voice against every instinct that told him powerful people apologized only when it served them. "You don't owe me an apology because of my past," he said carefully. "You owed me one because of what you said, regardless of who I turned out to be. That's the part that matters." Vivian absorbed the correction without flinching, which surprised him, and nodded slowly. "You're right," she said. "I've spent a long time believing that people who end up in service jobs simply didn't work hard enough to avoid it. My father built that belief into me before I could walk. I'm only now starting to understand how wrong it is." The admission hung between them, unexpected and a little raw, and Daniel found himself studying her more carefully than he had before, seeing past the tailored coat and the practiced composure to something more uncertain underneath. A woman who had clearly spent years building walls not entirely unlike his own, just constructed from different materials. "What exactly do you need from me?" he asked, steering the conversation back toward safer ground. "Legally, I mean." Vivian opened the folder fully now, walking him through the specifics of the Halden merger. The manufacturing line that depended on his calibration technology, the licensing signature that had to be secured before the deal could close, the timeline that gave them barely 3 weeks before the entire acquisition collapsed and took a significant portion of Cross Dynamics' quarterly projections down with it. Daniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he sat back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You want me to sign something that puts my name, my real name, back into a system I walked away from on purpose?" he said. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "I understand if you're not," Vivian said. And she meant it, though the words cost her something given how badly the company needed this resolved. "But I'd like you to consider it, not just for the deal. The technology you built is still saving lives, Daniel. Portable diagnostic calibration has cut early detection windows for exactly the kind of cancer Sarah had by nearly 40% since your patent entered wider use. You walked away from an industry that failed you. But the work itself didn't fail anyone. It's still out there doing what you built it to do." She hadn't planned to say that, hadn't known it would land the way it clearly did. Watching something crack open behind Daniel's carefully guarded expression. The specific grief of a man who had spent years believing his contribution to the world had ended in bitterness, and instead, learning it had quietly continued without him, saving strangers he would never meet from the exact fate that had taken his wife. He looked away for a moment, jaw tight. And when he looked back, his eyes were wet in a way he clearly hadn't expected and didn't welcome. "I need to think about it," he said finally, voice rougher than before. "I have a daughter, Emma. She's 6. If my name goes back into circulation, if reporters start asking questions about Halcyon or Sarah, I need to know she's protected from all of that." Vivian nodded immediately, something in her posture softening further at the mention of a child, an unguarded warmth Daniel hadn't expected from a woman he'd first encountered breaking a wine glass and blaming him for it. I'll build whatever protections you need into the agreement, she said. Confidentiality provisions, controlled disclosure, whatever keeps her out of it. This isn't about exposing you, Daniel. I just need the deal to close, and I'd like to do it in a way that doesn't cost you anything more than you've already lost. They sat in a silence that had shifted entirely from where it had started. No longer adversarial, something more fragile and unfamiliar settling into its place. And for a moment, neither of them moved to end it. It was Renee eventually who broke the moment, knocking softly and reminding Daniel his shift wasn't over. And Vivian rose to leave, gathering the folder with hands that seemed steadier than her expression suggested she felt. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you're the kind of man who lets pride get in the way of doing the right thing. I think you're the kind of man who's been protecting the people you love for so long, you've forgotten it's allowed to cost you something too." She left before he could respond, and Daniel stood alone in the small dining room for a long moment, turning her words over, feeling the careful architecture of his solitary life shift slightly on its foundation, not collapsing, but no longer quite as solid as it had been an hour before. 3 floors below Vivian's office the next morning, Whitman Cross sat across from a man named Reyes, a former compliance officer he'd quietly kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation, listening to a summary of what Reyes's contact inside legal had uncovered. "The original assignment paperwork from 9 years ago has some irregularities," Reyes said carefully, sliding a document across the desk, specifically around how credit was attributed during the initial licensing negotiation. "If Cole's name resurfaces publicly and someone reviews those old files closely enough, there's a reasonable chance it surfaces that the negotiation team, specifically you, structured the deal to minimize his attribution in exchange for a smaller upfront payout than the technology was actually worth." Whitman's expression didn't change, though something behind his eyes went very still. "That negotiation was handled entirely within legal parameters," he said, voice even. "Cole signed willingly. He wanted out of the industry. I simply facilitated a transaction he was eager to complete." "That may be true," Reyes said. "But if this deal moves forward and Cole's real identity becomes part of the public record, journalists covering the merger might dig into exactly how a grieving widower ended up signing away rights to technology worth considerably more than he received, especially if he ends up in the same room as your niece discussing terms. It wouldn't take much digging to make the story look considerably worse than a simple facilitation." Whitman sat with that for a long moment, turning it over with the particular calculation of a man who had spent 30 years learning to protect himself, before anyone else in the room finished forming their own strategy. "Then we make sure it doesn't become part of any public record," he said finally. "Vivian doesn't need to understand the full history of that old negotiation. She only needs the deal closed. I'll handle Cole directly, quietly, and make sure whatever agreement gets signed doesn't invite anyone to look backward." Reyes nodded, gathering his papers, and left Whitman alone with a problem that had until 3 days ago seemed permanently buried, and now sat directly across the hallway from the one person in the company he could least afford to have asking questions. Later that evening, back in his small apartment, with Emma finally asleep in the next room, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Vivian's folder open in front of him, the confidentiality language already drafted, waiting only for his signature to set the entire process in motion. He thought about Sarah, about the work they used to do together, about the strange, unexpected ache of learning his invention had gone on quietly saving lives without him. He thought about Vivian's face when she'd apologized unguarded, in a way that had surprised him more than he wanted to admit. And he thought finally about Emma asleep down the hall, and what it might mean for both of them if he let himself step back into a world he'd spent 8 years convinced he'd never be allowed to return to. He picked up the pen, held it for a long moment without moving, and set it down again, unsigned, telling himself he needed one more night to be certain. Though some part of him already suspected the decision had been made the moment Vivian said his wife's name aloud, with something that sounded unmistakably like genuine grief on his behalf. Daniel signed the confidentiality agreement on a Tuesday morning at his kitchen table, Emma eating cereal beside him and asking why he looked so serious, and he told her it was just paperwork for a new job opportunity, which felt both true and insufficient for the size of what he was actually agreeing to. He dropped the signed documents at Vivian's office that afternoon, and for the first time in 8 years walked out of a building with his real name attached to something that mattered, feeling lighter and more exposed than he had in longer than he could remember. Vivian met him in the lobby rather than sending an assistant, which he noted without comment, and the two of them stood for a moment in the marble entryway, the formal transaction complete, neither quite sure what came next, now that the business between them had technically concluded. "The Halden team wants a formal meeting Thursday," she said. "Legal engineering, the works. I'd like you there if you're willing."
Not required by the agreement, but I think it would help having the person who actually understands the technology in the room instead of just the paperwork. Daniel agreed before he'd fully considered what it would mean to sit in a boardroom again, surrounded by executives defending work he'd spent 8 years trying to forget he'd ever done. Thursday arrived with a tension Daniel hadn't anticipated. Walking into the Cross Dynamics headquarters in a borrowed blazer that fit him perfectly across his shoulders, aware of every glance from the security desk to the elevator, aware that he looked exactly like what he was, a man who didn't quite belong in this building anymore, if he ever had. Vivian met him on the 41st floor, and something in her expression when she saw him, a flicker of warmth she didn't quite manage to suppress, steadied him more than he expected it to. "You look like you're about to walk into an ambush," she said quietly, falling into step beside him. "It's just a conference room, Daniel. You built the technology. You know more about it than anyone in that room combined." He appreciated the reassurance, though it did little to settle the specific dread sitting in his chest. The dread of a man returning to a world that had once, in ways he still didn't fully understand, quietly erased his name from his own achievements. The conference room was already half full when they entered. Marcus Webb reviewing documents at the head of the table, 2 representatives from Halden's legal team seated across from empty chairs, clearly reserved for Vivian and Daniel, and at the far end, arms folded, watching Daniel's entrance with an expression carefully arranged into polite neutrality, sat Whitman Cross. Daniel felt something shift in the room the moment Whitman's eyes landed on him, a recognition that traveled in both directions, though Daniel couldn't immediately place the older man's face, only the unsettling certainty that Whitman recognized him. Vivian, unaware of the current passing between them, introduced Daniel to the room simply as the technical consultant whose licensing agreement had cleared the path for the merger. And the meeting began with the ordinary rhythm of corporate proceedings, timelines, provisions, technical specifications that Daniel answered with a fluency that surprised even him. Old knowledge surfacing easily despite 8 years of dormancy. It was 40 minutes in, during a discussion of the original patent's chain of custody, that one of Halden's attorneys, a meticulous woman named Priya Anand, pulled up an old document on the shared screen and frowned at something in the file metadata. "This is strange," she said more to herself than the room. "The original assignment paperwork from 9 years ago lists 2 additional signatories beyond Mr. Coleman, both from Cross Dynamics Technology Acquisitions Division at the time. One of them appears to be you, Mr. Cross." The room went very still. Whitman's expression didn't change immediately, but something in his posture stiffened, the particular stillness of a man calculating his next several moves before allowing himself to react at all. "I oversaw acquisitions during that period," Whitman said smoothly. "It's not unusual for me to have signed off on licensing agreements from that era.
I don't recall the specifics of this particular one.
Daniel felt something cold settle over him as the pieces began arranging themselves into a shape he hadn't expected. Memory surfacing slowly. A name from 9 years ago, attached to a negotiation he'd been too grief-stricken and desperate for money to examine closely at the time. "You were the one who structured my payout," Daniel said quietly, and every head in the room turned toward him. "I remember now. You told me the technology's commercial value was speculative, that most patents in early diagnostic calibration failed to find viable licensing partners, and that a lump sum was the more responsible choice given my circumstances." His voice was calm, but something underneath it had gone hard, memory sharpening with each word. "You told me that 8 days after my wife's funeral." Whitman's composure held barely, though a muscle in his jaw tightened visibly. "I gave you sound financial advice during a difficult time," he said. "I don't see the relevance of relitigating a transaction you willingly agreed to nearly a decade ago." Priya Anand, sensing the shift in temperature, glanced between them with growing alarm, and Marcus Webb had gone very quiet, clearly recalculating the legal implications of whatever was unfolding in real time. Vivian sat frozen for a moment, processing what she was witnessing, the pieces assembling themselves with a speed that left her feeling faintly nauseous. "Uncle Whitman," she said slowly, "did you personally structure the terms of Daniel's original patent assignment?" Whitman turned to face her, and for the first time in the conversation, something genuinely defensive crept into his voice. "I structured a transaction that was entirely legal and fully consented to," he said. "The technology's value wasn't as obvious then as it is in hindsight. I made a business decision that protected the company's interests." Daniel felt the old grief and anger buried for years rise up with a force that surprised him. "You knew what the technology could become," he said. "You must have, or you wouldn't have structured the deal specifically to minimize my share and keep my name off the primary filing. You used a man who just lost his wife and didn't have the energy to fight you. And now you're sitting across from me pretending it was generosity." The room had gone entirely silent. Every person present, recalculating their own position, in a situation that had shifted from routine merger negotiation to something considerably more explosive. Whitman's eyes flicked toward Vivian, and something passed between uncle and niece that Daniel couldn't fully read. An old current of family obligation and long-buried resentment that clearly predated this meeting by years. "Vivian," Whitman said, voice lower now, more urgent, "this is not the venue for this conversation. Whatever grievances Mr. Cole believes he has, they have no bearing on the current merger, and airing them here only jeopardizes a deal this company desperately needs." It was, Daniel realized, watching Vivian's face, exactly the wrong thing to say, an appeal to expedience over honesty. The same calculation her uncle had apparently made 9 years ago, when he decided a grieving widower's fair compensation was less important than the company's bottom line. Vivian's expression hardened in a way Daniel hadn't seen from her before. Not the practiced coldness she'd shown him at Aurelia, but something colder and more resolved. "No," she said quietly. "It has everything to do with the current merger, because I refuse to close a $400 million deal built partly on technology this company acquired by exploiting a man in the worst week of his life. I want the original transaction records, all of them, on my desk by tomorrow morning." Whitman's composure finally cracked just slightly, a flash of something closer to fear passing behind his eyes before he smoothed it back into practiced calm. "You're jeopardizing everything I've built for this company over a sentimental attachment to a man you've known for 3 weeks, he said, and the words landed in the room like something that had been simmering beneath the surface of the Cross family for far longer than this meeting. Vivian stood gathering her folder with hands that were, for the first time all week, entirely steady. "I'm not jeopardizing anything," she said. I'm making sure this company doesn't repeat the same mistake twice. This meeting is adjourned. Marcus, please arrange for the transaction records Whitman mentioned. We'll reconvene once I've reviewed them personally. The room emptied slowly, the Halden attorneys exchanging quiet, uneasy glances as they filed out, clearly recalculating whether this merger was still worth pursuing given the internal turmoil they'd just witnessed firsthand. Whitman lingered a moment longer, staring at Daniel with an expression that had lost all pretense of warmth. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet threat neither Vivian nor Daniel missed. "You should be careful what you dig up, Mr. Cole," he said. "Some things stay buried for good reason. I'd hate for your daughter to grow up reading about her father's messy legal disputes in the press." The words landed exactly where he intended them to, and Daniel felt something in him go cold and still. The specific fury of a threat aimed at Emma rather than at himself. "Don't," Daniel said, voice low, dangerous in a way Vivian hadn't heard from him before. "You don't get to use my daughter as leverage after what you already took from me." Whitman held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word, leaving the room heavy with the particular silence that follows a threat too clearly delivered to be mistaken for anything else. Vivian turned to Daniel the moment the door closed, her earlier resolve giving way to something more uncertain, almost apologetic. "I didn't know," she said, "about any of this. I swear to you I had no idea he'd been the one to structure your original deal." Daniel believed her, could see it plainly in the shock still visible in her expression. But the fury from Whitman's threat hadn't fully receded, and some of it, unfairly perhaps, found its way toward her, simply because she was standing in front of him and shared blood with the man who just threatened his daughter. "Your family built part of this company's success on my grief," he said, voice tight. "And now your uncle just threatened my daughter to keep it quiet. I need you to understand that I can't just move past that because you're upset about it too." Vivian flinched slightly at the accusation, though she didn't argue with it, absorbing it the way someone absorbs something they know on some level they deserve to hear, even if they didn't personally cause it. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to move past it. I'm asking you to let me fix it properly, not just for the deal, but because it's the right thing to do, regardless of what happens with Halden." Daniel studied her for a long moment, the anger still sitting hot in his chest, but underneath it something else. The memory of her apology at Aurelia, the genuine grief in her voice when she'd spoken about Sarah, the warmth he'd felt building between them over the past several days, despite every instinct telling him to guard against it. "I don't know if I can trust that Cross Dynamics won't just find another quiet way to protect itself," he said finally. "Your uncle's still on your board. He still has power in this building. What happens when I'm not standing in the room to defend myself?" It was a fair question, and Vivian didn't have an easy answer for it. Only the certainty in her own chest that she intended to see this through, regardless of what it cost her family relationships or her standing with the board. "Then stay in the room," she said. "Not as a consultant, as someone this company owes an actual apology to in writing with real terms attached. I'll bring it to the full board myself if I have to." Daniel didn't respond immediately, the offer sitting heavy and uncertain between them, echoing in a strange way the exact words he'd spoken to her weeks earlier, in a dining room that felt impossibly distant now. "Mock me again and see what you actually get for it." He hadn't meant it as a promise of vindication when he'd said it, only as a boundary drawn in a moment of exhaustion and grief. But standing here now, watching Vivian Cross choose honesty over her own family's comfort, he understood that the promise had come true in a way he never could have predicted, not through anger or revenge,
but through a woman who had once mocked him, learning slowly and imperfectly to see him clearly instead. That night, after Emma was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet around him, Daniel sat with his phone in his hand, staring at a text from Vivian that simply read, "Thank you for staying in the room today. I know it cost you something." He didn't respond right away, turning the day over in his mind. The fury, the vindication, the unexpected tenderness underneath all of it. And understood that whatever came next, board hearings, legal settlements, a merger that might or might not survive the revelation of Whitman's old betrayal. None of it mattered quite as much as the strange, unwelcome realization settling into his chest that somewhere over the past few weeks, without meaning to, he had started letting himself hope again. Not just for Emma's sake, but for his own. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, and Vivian arrived an hour early, sitting alone in the empty conference room with a stack of documents Marcus Webb had compiled over the weekend. Transaction records from 9 years ago, cross-referenced against current valuations. Internal emails from the Technology Acquisitions Division that painted a picture far uglier than she'd hoped to find. She had spent the previous 3 days reading through every scrap of paper connected to Daniel's original patent assignment. And what emerged was not a single moment of bad judgment, but a pattern, careful and deliberate, of Whitman Cross identifying vulnerable inventors and negotiating settlements designed to extract maximum value while offering minimum compensation, dressed up each time in language about market uncertainty and responsible financial guidance. Daniel's case wasn't an aberration. It was a method refined over years, and Vivian felt something in her chest go hollow and cold as she recognized how much of the company's early technological advantage had been built on exactly this kind of quiet exploitation. She had called Daniel the previous evening to tell him what she'd found, and his voice on the phone had carried a weariness that worried her more than anger would have. "How many others?" he'd asked, and she hadn't had a complete answer yet, only the growing certainty that the number wasn't small. "I need you there tomorrow," she'd said. "Not to relitigate what happened to you specifically, though that matters too. I need someone in that room who represents what this actually cost, in human terms, not just legal exposure." Daniel had been quiet for a long moment before agreeing, and Vivian understood without him saying it directly that walking back into that building represented something larger for him than a single meeting. A final test of whether the world he'd abandoned 8 years ago could be trusted to treat him honestly this time. The board members filed in slowly. 11 men and women who had known Whitman Cross for decades, some of whom had built their own careers on relationships he'd cultivated. And Vivian watched their faces carefully as she took her seat at the head of the table, trying to gauge how much resistance she'd face once the documents came out. Whitman arrived last, composed as always, taking his customary seat near the far end, with the easy confidence of a man who had weathered plenty of difficult board meetings before, and fully expected to weather this one as well. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, escorted by Marcus, dressed in the same borrowed blazer from the previous meeting, and Vivian caught his eye across the room, offering a small nod that she hoped conveyed more reassurance than she actually felt. She began without preamble, distributing copies of the compiled documents and walking the board through the pattern, methodically, name after name, inventor after inventor, each case bearing the same signature of exploitation disguised as generosity. She watched the room's temperature shift as she spoke, watched several board members' expressions harden, not toward her, but toward Whitman. Watched others glance nervously at their own copies, as though searching for their own names buried somewhere in the paper trail, worried about what their silence over the years might now cost them. Whitman sat through the presentation with his composure intact, though his knuckles had gone pale where his hands rested against the table, and when Vivian finished, he spoke before anyone else could react. "This is a distortion," he said, voice even but carrying an edge of genuine strain now.
Every transaction referenced here was legally sound. Difficult circumstances do not constitute exploitation. I built this company's technological portfolio through careful, aggressive negotiation, exactly what this board hired me to do for 30 years. Careful negotiation doesn't require targeting people 8 days after a funeral, Daniel said, and every head turned toward him, the room absorbing the presence of an outsider speaking with an authority none of them had expected. "I sat across from you 9 years ago, barely able to string a sentence together, and you told me my technology's value was speculative, while your own internal projections, which Vivian's team found in your files, valued it at 11 times what you eventually paid me. That's not negotiation. That's exploitation dressed up in a suit." Whitman's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something genuinely dangerous flickered behind his composed exterior. The look of a cornered man, calculating whether attack or retreat offered better odds of survival. "You signed the agreement willingly," he said. "No one forced your hand." Daniel held his gaze without flinching. "You knew exactly how desperate I was, and built your offer around that desperation, instead of around what the work was actually worth. There's a word for that. It isn't negotiation." One of the older board members, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had served on the board since before Vivian's father died, cleared her throat and spoke for the first time. "Whitman, how many of these cases are there?" she asked, and her voice carried none of the warmth she'd previously extended toward him in decades of shared meetings. "The document lists 7, Vivian answered before Whitman could construct a response. 7 inventors whose technology forms a substantial part of our current patent portfolio, all negotiated using variations of the same method, all during periods of personal crisis for the individuals involved." The room absorbed this in silence, and Vivian watched the calculation happening behind several board members' eyes. The recognition that this wasn't a minor scandal to be quietly managed, but a systemic pattern that could expose the entire company to significant legal and reputational risk if it ever became public through channels the board didn't control. "I move that we suspend Whitman Cross from all board and executive functions pending a full independent investigation into these transactions," Vivian said, and the words landed with a finality that made Whitman's composure finally crack, visibly color rising in his face as he turned to face her directly. "You're willing to destroy your own family's legacy over sentiment," he said, voice rising for the first time. "I built half of what this company is today. You'd throw that away because you've developed feelings for a waiter you've known for a month." The accusation was meant to wound, to reduce everything Vivian had uncovered to nothing more than an inconvenient infatuation. And she felt the old familiar pull to defend herself against the accusation of weakness, the same pull her father had trained into her since childhood. Instead, she found something steadier underneath it, a clarity that had been building in her for weeks without her fully recognizing it. "I'm not doing this because of my feelings for Daniel," she said, though she didn't look away from him when she said it, and something in her tone made clear she wasn't denying those feelings, only refusing to let them be used as a weapon against her judgment. "I'm doing this because this company cannot build its future on a foundation of exploitation and call it business strategy. You taught me that strength meant never showing weakness, Uncle Whitman. But what you actually taught me was how to justify cruelty as long as it produced good numbers. I'm not interested in that legacy anymore." The room was utterly silent now, and Eleanor Vance, along with 3 other board members, nodded slowly, and Vivian understood watching their faces that the vote would go her way, that whatever protection Whitman had built for himself over 30 years had finally run out, undone not by a dramatic confrontation, but by careful documentation,
and the simple cumulative weight of 7 names that could no longer be ignored. The vote passed 9-2. An hour later, Whitman's suspended pending investigation, his access to company systems, revoked before the meeting had even fully adjourned, and Vivian watched him gather his papers with hands that trembled slightly. Now, the first crack in decades of careful control. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that held equal parts fury and something almost like grief. The recognition of a man watching the last vestige of his power dissolve in a single meeting. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, though the threat had lost most of its weight now that his authority had been formally stripped away. "This company needs people willing to make hard choices, Vivian. You're about to learn that the hard way." She didn't answer him, and after a long moment, he left, and the room exhaled collectively, the tension breaking into quiet murmurs among the remaining board members, already discussing the practical logistics of the investigation ahead. Daniel found Vivian afterward in the small private office off the main conference room, standing at the window with her back to the door, and he understood, watching her shoulders, that whatever satisfaction the vote might have delivered, it had cost her something significant too. The final unraveling of a family relationship that had shaped her entire understanding of strength and legacy. "You okay?" he asked quietly. And she turned, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something genuinely unguarded in her expression. Exhaustion, mixed with relief, mixed with a grief he recognized because he'd carried a version of it himself for 8 years. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just ended my uncle's career in front of the entire board. I don't know how to feel about that yet." Daniel crossed the room and stood beside her, not touching her, giving her the space to decide what she needed. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think you destroyed anything that wasn't already broken. You just stopped protecting it." She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. And when she spoke again, her voice had steadied. "The 7 cases," she said. "I want to make it right. All of them, not just yours. Full compensation, adjusted for actual value. Public acknowledgement where the inventors want it. Whatever it takes." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 8 years. Not because the money mattered as much as it once might have, but because the acknowledgement did the simple, long overdue recognition that what had happened to him hadn't been fair, hadn't been his fault, hadn't been something he needed to carry silently for the rest of his life. "That would mean something," he said. "To all of us, probably. It's not really about the money anymore. It's about someone finally saying it happened, and it was wrong." The following weeks moved faster than either of them expected. The Halden merger, closing on revised terms that included full public acknowledgement of Daniel's contribution to the underlying technology, his name restored to the primary patent filing after nearly a decade of quiet erasure, and a settlement that finally reflected something closer to the actual value of what he'd built. Whitman's formal removal from the board followed shortly after, along with a quiet but thorough investigation that confirmed the pattern across all 7 cases, resulting in settlements for each of the affected inventors and a reputational reckoning for cross dynamics that Vivian handled with a transparency her father would never have permitted, understanding that the company's long-term survival depended on proving it could learn from its own worst instincts, rather than simply burying them again. Daniel used part of his settlement to move Emma into a better school district, one with a stronger program for the reading difficulties her teachers had flagged the previous year, and to finally pay off the medical debt that had shadowed him since Sarah's death, the weight of it lifting in a way that felt almost disorienting after so many years of careful, constant calculation. He didn't quit his job at Aurelia immediately, though. Renee, delighted by the whole unlikely turn of events, told him with a knowing smile that she fully expected him to eventually. And he found himself in quiet moments between shifts, sketching calibration diagrams on napkins again. Old instincts resurfacing with a warmth he hadn't expected to feel. The slow return of something he'd assumed was permanently lost to grief. Vivian visited Aurelia more often than the demands of running a company should have allowed, and their conversations gradually shed the careful formality that had defined them in the early weeks, settling into something easier, more honest, built on the specific kind of trust that comes from having witnessed each other at their most exposed. She met Emma for the first time on a Saturday afternoon at a small park near Daniel's apartment, nervous in a way that surprised her, given how comfortable she'd become negotiating with hostile board members and skeptical executives. And Emma, entirely unbothered by any of the complicated adult history behind the introduction, simply asked Vivian if she wanted to see her cartwheel. And Vivian, laughing for what felt like the first time in months, said, "Yes, please. Absolutely," and watched a small girl tumble sideways into the grass with an enthusiasm that cracked something open in her chest she hadn't realized had gone quiet for years. 3 months after the board meeting, Vivian stood in Daniel's kitchen on a Sunday evening, helping Emma with a math worksheet while Daniel cooked dinner, and the domesticity of the scene struck her with a force she hadn't anticipated. The recognition that somewhere in the chaos of merger negotiations and family betrayals and old grief resurfacing, she had built something here that felt more real than anything she'd constructed in her carefully curated professional life. Daniel caught her watching him from across the kitchen and smiled the easy, unguarded smile that had become more frequent over the past months, and set down the wooden spoon he'd been using to stir the sauce. "You're staring," he said, and Vivian didn't look away. "I'm allowed to stare," she said. "I own the company that's currently paying your consulting fees. Consider it professional oversight." Emma, without looking up from her worksheet, said, "You're both being weird," with the particular bluntness only a 6-year-old could deliver. And both adults laughed, the sound easy and unforced in a way that neither of them would have believed possible 4 months earlier. Later that night, after Emma had gone to bed and the kitchen had been cleaned, Daniel and Vivian sat on the small balcony of his apartment, the city spread out below them in a version of the same skyline visible from Vivian's much larger, much emptier apartment across town. And Daniel found himself thinking about the distance he'd traveled since the night he'd walked away from Aurelia with a tray of broken glass in his hands, certain that dignity was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. "I keep thinking about what I said to you that first night," he said. "Mock me again and see what you actually get for it. I meant it as a warning. I didn't expect it to actually mean something." Vivian leaned against him slightly, and he let her, the gesture natural now in a way it hadn't been even a few weeks earlier. "I think about it too," she said. "I've thought about it more than I probably should. It wasn't really a threat, was it? It was the truth. You knew exactly who you were, even when the rest of the world had forgotten." Daniel considered this, watching the lights flicker across the skyline. "I think I forgot too for a while," he admitted. "It took someone else seeing it before I could see it in myself again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the specific silence of two people who no longer needed to fill every space with words. And eventually, Vivian spoke again, her voice quieter now, more uncertain than he was used to hearing from her. "I know this is complicated," she said. "The company, the settlement, everything that happened with Whitman. I don't want you to feel like any of this, us, is tangled up in obligation or guilt on my part." Daniel turned to look at her directly, understanding that she needed the reassurance more than she wanted to admit, the old fear of being valued for the wrong reasons still sitting close beneath her composed exterior. "I don't feel obligated," he said. "I feel like I met someone who was cruel to me once out of her own pain, and then chose repeatedly to be honest and fair, even when it cost her something significant. That's not guilt. That's who you actually are, underneath everything your father and your uncle tried to teach you. I'd like to keep finding out more about that person, if you're willing. Vivian felt something in her chest loosen, the last remaining doubt dissolving into something steadier, and she nodded, unable to trust her voice for a moment before finally saying, "I'm willing." 6 months later, Cross Dynamics announced a company-wide initiative reviewing and restructuring compensation for all inventors and independent contractors who had contributed technology to the company's patent portfolio over the previous 2 decades. A policy that industry analysts noted as unusually progressive for a company of its size, and one that Vivian pursued not for public relations benefit, but because she had learned in the most personal way possible exactly what it cost people when companies treated brilliance as something to be quietly extracted rather than fairly rewarded. Daniel accepted a formal consulting position with the company's engineering division, working part-time on next-generation diagnostic calibration systems, his name once again attached publicly to work he'd once believed he'd abandoned forever. And Emma, thriving in her new school, occasionally accompanied him to the office on days off, charming the engineering team with a confidence that reminded more than one of them of her father's quiet, steady brilliance. On a warm evening in late autumn, Daniel took Emma and Vivian to dinner at a small, unpretentious restaurant across town, deliberately avoiding Aurelia, wanting this particular evening to belong to something entirely new rather than layered over old history. Emma, delighted by the novelty of a family dinner that felt increasingly normal despite its unconventional origins, chattered happily about her day at school, while Daniel and Vivian exchanged glances across the table that carried an entire unspoken conversation about how far they'd traveled since a shattered wine glass had first thrown their lives together. When the check arrived, Vivian reached for it out of old habit, and Daniel gently pulled it toward himself instead, meeting her eyes with a small, deliberate smile. "I've got this one," he said. "Believe it or not, I can actually afford it now." Vivian laughed, the sound warm and unguarded, and let him understanding that the gesture carried more weight than the price of a dinner. The quiet reclamation of a dignity he'd once believed had been permanently stolen from him. Walking home together afterward, Emma asleep against Daniel's shoulder and Vivian's hand loosely laced with his free one, Daniel found himself thinking, not for the first time, about the strange, unlikely path that had led him here. From a shattered wine glass and a moment of humiliation to this quiet, ordinary evening, walking through a city that had once felt entirely hostile to everything he'd lost. He thought about Sarah briefly, the way he often did in quiet moments, grateful in a way he hadn't expected to feel again, that some part of the work they'd once built together was still out in the world doing good, still carrying forward something of who they'd been before grief had taken so much from him. And he thought about Vivian walking quietly beside him, a woman who had once mocked him without knowing what he'd survived, and who had spent the months since learning patiently and honestly to see him clearly, instead choosing integrity over inheritance, choosing him over the easier, safer version of her old life. "Mock me again," he told her once, "and see what you actually get for it." Never imagining that what she'd actually get in the end was not vindication or revenge, but something far more valuable. A family neither of them had known they were still capable of building. Forged not from wealth or power, but from the harder, more honest work of finally being seen.